Welcome back to the Boardroom Conversations podcast. Thanks for joining us today, where we're going to be talking about good and bad leaver clauses. I'm Helen Ingram. I'm an associate in the corporate team here at Collier Bristow, and today I'm joined by Ragavan. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Helen. I'm a partner in the corporate team here at Collier Bristow. I also chair the private equity audience group, and therefore have a particular interest in good and bad leaver clauses because they often form an integral part of private equity investments, and in particular, the nexus between management, the road to an exit, and incentivizing management to perform.
Brilliant. Well, sort of building off that interest as a starting point, is it worth just saying a few words about why often management might receive shares in a company?
Yeah, so it's kind of fairly traditional private equity structure to ensure that once you've invested into a company, management are suitably incentivized to take the value of the company forward. And one of the ways to align management with the idea that they're going to drive growth with a view to an exit is always the game plan with private equity investments, is to give them shares in the company. And as such, as the company grows in value, so they have essentially skin in the game, so their shares grow in value. And we're talking about broadly about management here. We're talking specifically generally about directors also employees of the company, and that's going to be an important point which I'll come back to later on. I think when we're discussing how to tie up the behaviour of of management as director and employee of the company with the potential positive and negatives of good and bad leaver clauses.
It makes sense, doesn't it? You want everyone pulling in the same direction, don't you? I mean, ultimately, that's what's going to be best for the company and for the shareholders, including these particular individuals. If you've issued shares to management, to whoever it might be, then obviously the question arises of, well, what happens when they leave the company? And I guess that's what leaver clauses here, good and bad leaver, is intended to legislate for. So can you perhaps give us just a bit of an explanation as to how it works?
Yeah, exactly so. So individuals within a company, management have been given shares in order to drive the value of the company. And as you identify, if they leave the company, there needs to be some kind of mechanic which deals with the fact that they're no longer entitled to their shares because they're no longer with the company. So ordinarily, the first point of call is there'll be an event where the management person who has shares will leave the company, and then that may be for a variety of reasons. And I think diving into the detail of the reasons behind why they're leaving also determines the price at which they may get their shares. But at a kind of macro level, essentially what you want to do is get the shares back out of the management's hands. So once they leave, traditionally, what will happen, it'll trigger a transfer notice, and those shares will be subject to transfer to, and this is where the detail of the clause comes in. It may be the shares may be subject to transfer back to the company, or they may be subject to transfer to other shareholders, or indeed, they may be subject to transfer to incoming management. Because the idea is that if management have left, you're going to need people to replace them to do the job that management was doing. And therefore, to appropriately incentivize incoming management, those pool of shares needs to be clawed back and then redistributed potentially.
Yeah, I mean, again, it seems pretty sensible because that's preventing departing employees from, say, potentially going to work for a competitor, but still benefiting from the success of the company, but also for the other shareholders, preventing that share dilution that you're going to have to find a replacement.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. You don't want to then be having to issue more shares so that everyone else's shareholdings are reducing in value.
Yeah, what you say don't want is management who are leaving, so sitting there and illegitimately holding onto their shares and benefiting from the increasing value of the company. Meanwhile, you're trying to get in similarly high caliber individuals to replace them, and you can't really incentivize them without diluting other people. Exactly. So the management pool or share capital is there to incentivize management. If you cease to be management, it needs to trigger a consequence. And then we kind of move on to what is that consequence? It's beyond just having your shares taken off you. It kind of speaks to the circumstances in which you leave, speaks to the price you're going to achieve for your share.
And what kind of, because you touched on this already in terms of the circumstances in which someone might leave. When you're thinking about drafting these clauses, what sort of circumstances are going to constitute a bad leaver or versus a good leaver? I mean, we'll circle back to the pricing point in a moment, but just before we get to that.
Yeah. The kind of circumstances when people leave a company obviously kind of vary from a perfectly legitimate reason to a slightly less legitimate reason to a neutral reason. And there's a whole spectrum on good and bad leaver triggers, as it were. And I've seen a spectrum of, you start with, you're a very, very good leaver, then you're a good leaver, a leaver, a bad leaver, a very, very bad leaver.
You can cover off every possible scenario.
Yeah. And they each have different kind of circumstances, not only the pricing, but also how much shares can be clawed back. Because I kind of mentioned that you want to claw back potentially all of the shares from a departing management shareholder. But in certain circumstances, actually, if it's been commercially negotiated by both sides, they may not give back all the shares. They may just give part of their shares if the circumstances in which they're leaving are kind of more understandable to the remaining shareholders, to the remaining company, people with interest in the company. I guess speaking about the extremes, what I could safely say is that if you've been behaving fraudulently in a way that's been prejudicing the company's interests, everyone's
going to be pretty bad.
That's really bad. Yeah. You should suffer the appropriate consequences. All your shares should be taken back from you at a very much reduced price, for example.
Yeah.
But then equally, and similarly, if you resign, so it's within your control that you're leaving the company, again, it'd be sensible that, well, you're not here till the end of the project. You voluntarily decide to leave. Then, your shares should be clawed back again, a lot of them at an appropriate price. However, shifting on the scale to what maybe considered more good leaver circumstances, if you have to leave the company because of ill health, i.e. circumstances which are entirely outside your control as an individual, then commercially you may have negotiated prior to receiving your shares that would be considered good leaver because, frankly, you haven't done something specifically that's been prejudicial to the company. It's, circumstances outside your control. Often the investors are sympathetic to that not being necessarily a bad leaver situation. But things like behaving in a way which is fraudulent or dishonest or misappropriating company funds, resigning, all those things are generally considered not good and therefore bad. There's very many different ways to structure this, but often a traditional structure, I think the BBC adopts this, is that they define bad leaver fairly narrowly and then say good leaver is everything when you're not a bad leaver. Yeah. And they also importantly leave it up to the discretion of the board to separately decide circumstances where you are a good leaver.
Yeah, and that can be really helpful, can't it, to allow, because it really isn't possible to foresee every possible scenario that might arise in the future. So to allow your board some discretion, some flexibility to form decisions on things that were just never in the contemplations of the individuals who were originally deciding on those definitions.
It gives you some room for nuance, and obviously a lot of the time there's a commercial negotiation. Things are hardly ever black and white, but you can legislate for the things which are obviously black and white, but then there's always some grey areas where it's often useful to have a bit of discretion within the hands of the remaining stakeholders, the majority shareholders, the main board, as it were. So you can deal compassionately with circumstances that arise.
No, absolutely. And I guess the other scenario to be considered is when, I mean, you've slightly touched on this, but where it's the individual in question has perhaps been fired or let go in some way. And often this is as a result of their behavior. So to coin your phrase from earlier, if you're not good, you're bad. but also to have, if you're aiming for a degree of even-handedness, then to have carve-outs for, let's say, scenarios which are found to be constructive dismissal, or building in that wiggle room to allow for unforeseen circumstances.
I think you're exactly right. I think it's it's a question to be negotiated, but it's not unreasonable to suggest that if you've been forced out and constructively dismissed, it would be unfair and inexorable to kind of penalise you by losing your share as well. It's often an emotive issue negotiating good and bad leaver, but it's something that you do need to address your minds to when there isn't a good and bad lever situation currently being contemplated. It is much better for people to have these conversations early on in the piece
in advance.
and in advance, and everyone has clarity as to what the position is going to be. So it's an area where it's important that when you're drafting your constitutional documents, you make sure they marry up with your employment agreements and your director service agreements. Because I think, as you said, often a ground for bad lever is if you're underperforming. And what you'd often want to do is enable an individual's underperforming to have their service agreement terminated. So you want to make sure that you have joined up thinking in terms of doing that definition and say that, for example, if there are grounds to summarily dismiss you under your service agreement, you are a bad lever as well. Which it makes it kind of neater closer so that if you do have management that are underperforming, make sure you draft in the employment contract their clause wide enough that they can be dismissed. And then make sure at the same time you're dismissing them, you're taking back their shares because essentially they're not performing. So that's like an important point of just making sure those areas match up.
I feel like that's something that we end up saying on this quite a lot, that you really want to make sure that the full suite of documents all aligned to avoid any mismatch.
I think it's a really valid point, Helen. I think that as lawyers, we kind of often get involved in the detail of the documents, but part of that detail is being able to take a step back and see how all the documents across the suite of an investment kind of interact is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where one agreement is requiring you to act in a certain way and another one's requiring you to do the exact opposite, because that's when things are going to get messy. On that point, so having sort of talked about what might fall under the definition of being a good or bad lever, or even very bad, we've discussed that will often trigger, for example, the obligation to transfer some or all of your shares, but also it will affect the pricing for those shares. Or how do you normally envisage that working?
The fairly kind of standard pricing is that if you're a bad lever, you get even to be a bad lever, you get the lower of nominal value or market value. And that's often on the basis that these shares don't have a high nominal value. But I'd always counsel people to actually look at what the nominal value of their shares are and how many shares have been issued.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you have underperforming management, even £3,000 that, if they've got £3,001 shares can be quite irritating to pay out.
Yeah.
It'll cost more to do a market valuation than £3,000 to say, well, actually, you've been behaving so badly, your 3,000 shares are worth nothing. So I think it's kind of always be mindful of not slavishly following the traditional paradigm of a lower of fair value or market value or nominal value. And it's necessary to say, like a 1p per share or 1p in total, just makes
something that really is going to wind people
up. But it is all subject to commercial negotiations. And as we say, look, they may be different. That's the simplest mechanic and that's the traditional thing. And the corollary of that is that if you're a good lever, you get market value on the basis that the company is valuable and you're kind of being incentivized at the point you're leaving for the work you've done thus far. Well, you've been incentivized up to point, you'll be rewarded for the work you've done thus far, which may be kind of sensible if you're just leaving for, as I say, grounds of ill health or retirement, and there's no ill will between the parties at all. But then you can cast the pricing. It could be aligned with the behavior of the management, could determine how much of a discount to market value you're applying. So if you behave very badly, it's a 100% discount. Or if you behave less badly, it's a 25% discount. It's kind of up to you to decide how sophisticated it could be. And that's both on the pricing, but also, as I said before, in relation to how many shares are subject to clawback. Because you could have a situation where, and often sometimes you have a situation, and I often, when I've seen from both sides, because I act for investors quite a bit, but equally I act for management teams. So I'm kind of always looking at things from both sides of the table to kind of determine a fair solution, because you need management incentivized in the way that they feel that their shares are real and not subject to kind of capricious clawback. You need it.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, there's really it's not going to have the desired effect, is it, of that buy-in to the success of the business.
Exactly. So for being on the management side of the table, you want to ensure that it isn't as kind of complete discretionary, and there are clear grounds, and you may want to negotiate at quite a granular level how many shares can be clawed back, or actually if you've been taken on as management and you feel that you've been incentivized for a certain project and you've delivered on that project, or you would have delivered on that project after a certain amount of time, then sometimes you often find that you have this idea that the amount of shares which are subject to clawback reduces from over time. So from day one, they may be 100% clawback, but after a relevant period has elapsed, say 2 years or a year or whatever you negotiate, then only 50% are subject to clawback, and eventually none are subject to clawback, because the idea is you've demonstrated your loyalty to the project, you haven't left, and that by the time, and therefore your shares are equally important part of your remuneration package. Although I'll come back to
yeah. We'll put a pin in that one for the moment.
The word remuneration and share capital management around too lightly.
I think it's really helpful the way that you've expressed it, because actually there is a huge amount of oh, you're welcome, a huge amount of flexibility in there that people don't necessarily appreciate. There is the kind of, as you've mentioned, the market standard, but actually it can go beyond that to allow for a greater variety of scenarios or different pricing models or whatever it might be. It's worth bearing in mind, isn't it?
You need to tailor the situation to the facts at hand.
Exactly.
I mean, I've been in meetings where I've had the head of private equity at a prominent firm swear blind to me that death was never a ground for being a bad leaver, because obviously that's completely out of control of management. But I still managed to negotiate into a transaction on behalf of an investor going forward, purely because on the circumstances, the death of the person would be so catastrophic to the business model that we need the shares back. Nothing is immutable. There are things which are considered market standard, and the BVCA have very good guidance. And, obviously you and I know we've developed our own views and as time gone on, but, you should always just take a step back. Why are these shares being given to this person? In what circumstances do I need to claw these shares back? And in what circumstances are they reasonable to claw back, at what price, and how many shares can be clawed back? And just drop it into those different buckets: circumstances, amount of shares, pricing per share, and then build out something that's commercially acceptable to both sides.
Absolutely. It's not one size fits all. So on that basis, that it should be sort of tailored to the specific situation. And we've slightly touched on a few points on this already, but if you were talking to an investor or a director of a company who is at that point of putting this into place, what would be the points that you would say they absolutely need to consider from the outset?
From the outset, they do need to understand from both sides what they want to achieve, essentially. So if you're management, you need to kind of know what your value is and say, well, actually, if I'm here after 2 years and I don't want any of my shares to be subject to clawback, well, that's going to be a key point for you, right? And make sure that you're making the documents the fact that there's a built-in time limit on good and bad leaver. If I'm talking about management, I'm saying also make sure that the room for discretion in the decision of whether you're good and bad leaver is minimized, so that you can't be made a bad leaver in circumstances which are unfair. I think on the flip side,
are you going to say exactly the same in reverse?
Be realistic in what you want to achieve, and understand that if management were to leave, what do you need in order to keep the project going? Make sure you can get the shares back, and make sure that you do have discretion, if to the extent you have, to keep people in line, because it's really powerful stuff. If you want people to grow a business and therefore you're giving them shares, they need to know that they need to stay on track with the plan. Bad leaver is more than just about underperformance. It's also about management leaving and setting up capacity for you. So make sure make sure you have an ability to enforce bad leaver if they breach covenants in the shareholders agreement, anti-competitive covenant. So make sure that you're looking at the broader picture to ensure that the leaver clauses, the good and bad leaver clauses, are focusing the mind of the management team in a way that it needs to be focused. Everyone knows that if they achieve the exit, they'll get a fair return. But if they don't, then they won't.
Well, it's about hitting that sweet spot, isn't it? Of everyone's minds are focused on achieving whatever the objective is, and incentivized appropriately for doing that. And of course, the flip side is that if that isn't achieved, then consequences. You mentioned previously that we would touch briefly on the tax point.
I have. I do a lot of things, but I'm not a tax lawyer. These podcasts are just to give you a flavour of what we can do. If you need bespoke advice, do come to us directly and we can help you out. Yeah, just always something which I'm mindful is the dangers of HMRC conceptualizing shares which have been given to management as disguised employment income. And that is a very much worse tax treatment for management. And that's, and it can also have consequences for the company as well, in terms of if they haven't been given appropriate next contribution, etc. You very much want the returns from any shares conceptualized as a capital receipt rather than an income receipt. HMRC can run the argument that because they're receiving their shares as part of the work they're doing, it should be conceptualized as an income receipt rather than capital receipt. So I won't get into much into ITPA and all that now, but just briefly, I wanted to mention when putting together these documents, obviously we can help you with the legal side, but I would counsel you to also get structuring tax accounting advice as investors, as management, to make sure you're not tripped up by HMRC further down the line.
I think it is a really helpful point to bring to clients' attention, because it's easy for them to think, oh, well, this is another professional advisor's fee that I have to pay for, that I don't want to pay for. But it can, first of all, save you a lot of money in the long term. And it is really important. And again, sort of, I feel like the general theme of this conversation has been around that balance of interest between the employee and the company and the other shareholders. And again, it's very much in the interests of both to ensure that neither party is hit with an unexpected tax, an unwelcome tax bill compared to all those welcome ones that we all see.
That's what I was going to say.
On that note, that's probably all we're going to...
I'm not going to be invited back, am I? Oh, no. It was going so well.
It was going well. What can I say? Thanks, everyone, for listening. We hope you found this interesting and useful. And of course, if you have any questions, do feel free to contact either of us. You can find our details on the website at collierbristow.com. But for now, until next time, bye.
Bye.